everyone, and thanks for joining. Today, I'm talking with Mike Balotti, who is an education consultant for families on the main line. How's it going, Mike?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you today?
Great.
Good.
So,
Thanks for
Mike,
having
can
me.
you start by telling us about your background and how you got into this line of work of working with families who need help choosing schools on the main line?
Yeah, great question. First off, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. So I got into this because when I went to college, I ended up transferring colleges and worked with an educational consultant at that time who helped me evaluate what my options looked like and in turn helped my brother look at his medical school options. When he was applying medical school, he did some help with my sister in her legal career. So did a lot for our family over the years. And interestingly, he is a guy, he's effectively retired at this point, but he was a number of years ago director of admissions at University of Pennsylvania prior to Lee Stetson's tenure. And he was one of the founders of this field, of the educational consulting field in the mid 70s when he and his name is Jim Nolan, and when his partner and friend or colleague and friend, Jim Johnston, who was director of admissions at Wharton, they spun off to help students from abroad who wanted to come to the US to study at the post-secondary level. And together with a number of other people, they effectively founded what is now called the IECA, or the field of educational consulting. IECA is Independent Educational Consultants Association, and that was the mid 70s. So I had the opportunity to work with him as a client when I was transferring colleges, and ultimately, I guess he got sick of giving me free advice over the years because at some point he said, "If you want to come work for it, there's a job here for you." So I started doing this kind of work in 2003, and well, started working in private pay alternative education in 2001. And of that 22 years, about 15 of that has been working as an educational consultant.
Okay, awesome. So I'm assuming based on your answers, you did grow up on the main line or somewhere in the Philadelphia area. Is that
Yeah, I
right?
actually grew up in Wilmington, in Delaware, and so I
Okay.
went to Wilmington Friends School from fifth grade through high school graduation. So to some degree, if you're in certain parts of Delaware geographically or so socially or socioeconomically, it's relatively akin to being on the main line.
Yeah. Okay. And do you have kids now who are of school age?
So I'm a bit of an older dad. I have relative to my age, I have young kids. So I have a 5 and a 3 year old. And so in terms of my wife and I had previously been living in the city. And so looking at different districts in the greater Philadelphia area was part of our decision. And ultimately we chose to move to Wynwood to get into the Lower Merion district.
Okay, great. So can you give us a full picture of the families with whom you work as a consultant? Are they typically moving here from another state, or are they already here and wanting a change in schools?
It's a great question. I think there's a number of different ways to answer that. The quick, easy answer is a little bit of both. If I were to break down who I work with, depending on the year, it's probably about a third of the families that I work with are looking for traditional schools of some sort, right? So those are local independent schools, sometimes evaluating which public district is the best match. Sometimes they're in a public district and they're evaluating, should we stay in this public school, or let's take a look at the alternatives in the independent school options and see which of those might be better. And if they're not, they're not, and we'll stay in the public district. So that's about, and or looking at traditional boarding schools or boarding schools that have particular learning supports for kids. That's about roughly a third of what I do, maybe 40%, depending on the year. The remaining portion is I work with students who have special needs or need therapeutic interventions as well. So we're really looking at very specialized alternatives, either, based on the mental health world or academic options for those students as well.
Okay.
Sometimes it's folks that are coming from elsewhere. You live in, I don't know, Seattle, or pick your place, and you're being relocated to the Philadelphia area. Sometimes we'll help families take a look at which are the best options around here, or should we look at the independent schools, or should we be evaluating which is the best district for us.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, as a real estate agent, I do work with people who relocate to this area. I think we all know, you and I know as parents of young children, that moving is stressful.
Oh
And
yeah.
moving when you have children is actually even more stressful.
Yeah.
And if you have to figure out where they're going to go to school, that's like a big burden that parents carry. So when a new family approaches you, what is your first step in trying to help them?
Well, I'll totally agree with you that moving is stressful. We moved about 2.5 years ago, and I hope to never do it again until, well, maybe one more when I retire somewhere warm ultimately, but that'll be the last time. I also think at the same time there can be something cathartic about moving in that you can really sort of take inventory of your life in a number of different areas, whether those are your physical belongings or prioritizing what your needs are as a family or what any one of your individual child's needs are. And looking at that and saying, okay, where are we? Where do we want to be? What are our goals, both long term and short term? And what are the steps that we need to take to reach those goals, right? That can be a part of the moving process, but not always, right? And so I think to answer your question, one of the things that we try to do initially in onboarding a family is what I would call investigation, right? We recognize that we are coming onto a moving train. There are a great number of people and a great number of supports that have already been involved in the family's life, in the child's life, in their care, whether those are teachers, administrators, support staff, sometimes outside folks like therapists or psychiatrists or tutors or whatever it may be. And so getting to know the entire picture of the child and the family, what their needs are and what their goals are. And sometimes it's one of the things that, oddly, in a lot of the conversations I have with families, sometimes parents haven't been able to step back and take that larger perspective and say, okay, well, what are our goals, right? What are our goals for this year, for these next number of years, or 5, 10, 20 years down the road? Because we're so busy as parents in the day to day, right? We're so busy just in what's happening in everybody's lives and putting food on the table and doing laundry and all the things that we all have to do, that sometimes it can be, I think that can just be forgotten a little bit. So really what we try and do is learn as much as we can initially. We like to speak to some of those other professionals that have been involved in the kid's life. Again, teachers, administrators, outside folks. We love to see all the paperwork. That can be grade reports, teacher comments, if there's an IEP or a 504. We'd love to see all that paperwork. And then, when appropriate, we love to meet with the student as well and spend some time with them. It's one of the things that I think anybody who gets into the field of education in some way, shape, or form does it because they enjoy working with kids and wanting to help and wanting to make a difference. And I've found as my career has moved on, I spend less and less time with the kids themselves and more time with the families and the other professionals and the folks from the schools involved. So whenever we get the chance to spend time with kids, it's always welcomed.
Yeah, I like that a lot because I used to work in education research and going into schools was always my favorite. Like if I could
Yeah.
see a student, see a teacher, see a classroom, see a principal, that was like a good day for me. So
Well, yeah,
anyway,
it's a great day and you get a lot of information there. There are times
yeah.
when I'll go to a family's home to meet with them or to meet with a child or whatever it may be, and you learn a lot when you go into somebody's house, right? You walk into a kid's room and you see what posters they have on the wall, you see how clean or unclean their room is and what they have scattered around, and you learn a lot about what their interests are, how their organization skills are functioning. You learn a lot of information. You learn a lot about the family dynamics, and that's all helpful in terms of being able to gather the data we need to be able to make appropriate recommendations.
Awesome. So, what criteria about a school do you consider when trying to figure out the best placement for a particular family or a particular child?
Yeah, another great question. You've got some really good ones lined up here. So I think in some way that goes back to what we were talking about before, right? What are the objectives? What are the goals? Why are we making the change? Again, apart from being relocated, we can see what the impetus there is. But absent that, what is the impetus for change? What are we trying to achieve? And if we can identify what those things are and identify what the goals are, that can help to refine some of what we're looking at and what the criteria could be or should be in evaluating different schools. So, I mean, I would say that all sorts of things go into that, right? We look at what is the academic program, what are the child's interests, both academically and outside of academically. How do they function socially? What kind of other students are they attracted to? Are they into sports? Are they into the arts? Or do they want to be involved in clubs? Do they want to do things largely outside of school? So we have to look at a number of different things. We also have to look at geography. I mean, I have parents who sometimes live in the city and they want to, evaluate an independent school way out in the suburbs. And it sounds great on paper until you realize that that's an hour commute each way, 2 times a day. And so, so somebody's spending a lot of time in the car.
Yeah, yeah.
And then we have to look at finances as well. I think clearly one of the things that's happening is independent schools are becoming more and more expensive over the years. And so we try to factor in any number of these different things. And we try to work with parents to help determine what's the order of priority here, right? Again, relative to what the goals are. And if we can start with those bigger picture things and work our way down to some of the more narrow and specific ideals, I think what we find is that appropriate schools generally rise to the top of the list.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about families and their financial situations, just because, as a real estate agent, I am fully aware of how insanely expensive it is to buy a home in this area on the main
Yeah.
line. And then private school, of course, is its own expense. And
Yeah.
so how do you approach that, or how do you handle the situations where the family's financial situation may not line up with the private school that would be best for their child, or even the school district that is best for their
Yeah.
child?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. That's a hard thing to navigate, right? And interestingly, I think that we live in a part of the country where people, the values communally, or in the society of this part of the country, people are really willing to invest in their kids. Okay, they're willing to invest time, they're willing to invest energy, they're willing to invest a lot of money in
Yes.
schools, in the homes in appropriate districts, whatever it may be. Whereas if you live in other parts of the country, the values are different, right? And people just sort of take what they get, or there aren't as many independent options in other parts of the country, so people
Right.
just are limited by that.
Yeah.
So I will say that one of the things I've seen is that largely people are pretty willing to dedicate a lot of resources to their kids in this area, right? Whether that's in a home purchase or whether that's in funding a private tuition. But you're right, if you're looking at two, sometimes three or four kids, you could be staring down a couple $100,000 per year, and that's now of
Right.
of tuition. And
Right.
and I think it's one of the hard things that we have. These are some of the hard discussions that we have to have, right? And then of course we are independent. We're not affiliated with any school or program as well, so we are fully financed and paid by the family.
Yeah.
So I'm always willing to make adjustments to my fee. I could care less about that. But the trick becomes if the resources are limited and tuition is going to be tight, I may not be able to be of best service because there's fee for our service as well.
Right.
But it's certainly one of the tough things, and it's a hard thing because I think what it does ultimately lead to is some stratification of within different parts of society of being able to have access to good schools and sometimes not being able to have that access.
Right, absolutely. I mean, the difference between the city of Philadelphia and the
Yeah,
suburban districts is stark. I mean, it's
yeah,
it's huge, which is one of the reasons a lot of people move from Philadelphia to the suburbs. I think
absolutely.
once their kids approach school age, that ends up being kind of an impetus sometimes if they can afford to leave and if they want to. So I know that, there's so many schools on the main line. There's a lot of districts on the main line. There's the adjacent districts, and then there's all of the private parochial schools. How do you organize all of your information on the schools and then keep that information up to date? Because I would imagine that things change. I mean, maybe not super quickly, but they
Yeah.
do change over time.
So the old joke is that colleges and universities change over decades, traditional schools change over years, and then all the therapeutic programs change over the course of months, right? So in terms of how I have to structure my body of knowledge and refreshing that body of knowledge, you have to look at it in different time periods, right? So yeah, I mean, largely, I would say with respect to the independent options, the independent schools, they don't necessarily change who they are or what their general profile of student may be. Of course, schools are living, breathing organisms like any other business or any other entity, and they evolve and they change and they add programming and they subtract programming, and new people come on board. A new head can take the school in a very different direction.
Mm-hmm.
New department chairs, whatever it may be, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, in my opinion, nothing replaces being on a campus. Nothing replaces having that firsthand knowledge and getting to see what's happening on different campuses. It's one of my favorite parts of the job is getting out and traveling. I will also say that if you ask my wife, that's probably her least favorite part of my job, because I fly somewhere between 75 and 100,000 miles a year all over the country and sometimes internationally, visiting different schools and programs all across the country. And so I think I think one of the downfalls is it's really easy for me to say, okay, yes, I need to go evaluate these five things that are happening in California or wherever it may be. And oh yeah, the schools in my backyard, they're always going to be there. Right. So I can go see those anytime. And sometimes they fall down my list a little bit. But, how do you categorize the information? I have yet to find the system that does all of what I wanted to do. So it's sort of constantly updating databases and making sure that they're as accurate as can be. And that could in a lot of ways be a full-time job unto itself. But again, I think connecting with people that are on campus is always very helpful. As mentioned, as part of my onboarding process, I speak with a couple of the kids' teachers or the administrators. And I think having those conversations over years, I mean, there are times when I'll speak with a teacher and we will have worked together on 2, 3 previous cases. And so I can talk to them, okay, well, what's happening in the school these days? What's the flavor? What's the feel? What's going on? And when you build enough relationship, much like any profession, when you build enough relationship, you get more honest information over time. And so continuing to forge and foster those relationships is really helpful. Being on campus is very helpful. Of course, being on everybody's email list is very helpful, as well as, just trying to keep track of any changes. And also the other thing I'll say is parents are almost always really reliable sources of information. And in my conversations with parents and whether that's through the onboarding process or down the road, sometimes after kids have graduated, a lot of times parents are sharing really, really helpful things and they give great feedback. So if we work together and we help them find school A and the kid goes to school A for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, sometimes parents will call me and say, hey, here's what's going on. Here's what's happening. This is what they're telling us. This is the information that we're seeing. And that kind of, again, direct, open, and honest discourse is incredibly helpful for me to be able to guide the next set of parents that I'm working with.
Mm-hmm. So when you're flying all over the country, are you going to boarding schools that families around here might be sending their children to, or are you actually a consultant for families basically around the country?
Again, both. I would say that probably 70 to 75% of my clients, of families that I work with, are probably within an hour or maybe 2 hours of Philadelphia.
Okay,
Obviously, you can't go 2 hours east of Philadelphia, but you can go 2 hours up to New York. You can go 2 hours down to DC. You can get out to
right,
Pittsburgh, all these things. But by and large, people are within the greater Philadelphia area.
right.
But I do work with families from all over the country, and you have a great experience or forge a great relationship with one client, and their cousin lives in Iowa, right? And
Right.
so they ask your name on. So I work with families internationally. Sometimes students who want to come to the U.S. to study at some of the really wonderful schools we have here. But yeah, so part of it is working, meeting clients or getting to know the region where they're coming from, but largely I would say it's visiting schools, right? So if I'm going to a school and I'm doing a site visit and learning all the information that I need to learn, that gives me information to be able to come back and make good faith recommendations to families here. So if a client comes to me and says, I heard about school B, I can say, yeah, sure, that's a great option. I was actually just there 3 months ago, and I think that could be a really good choice, and here's why. Or likewise, I could say, I don't know that that's a great match for your child or for you, and here's why. So it's a little bit of both.
Okay, perfect. I know that you mentioned in the beginning that you often work with families who have children with special needs. So, how do you take that into consideration when you're working with them?
Well, we have to, right? And I think that one of the things, and for better or for worse, I've been doing this long enough where we've seen that evolve over the course of a couple decades. That, when I started doing this, gosh, I'd be hard to put a number on it, but some smaller percentage of, for example, traditional schools, whether those are local independent schools or traditional boarding schools, some smaller percentage of them had learning support programs built in. Now, could they augment stuff for individual kids? Yeah. But did they have formal learning support built into their schools or into their programs? No. And fast forward 20 years, here we are. Every school does,
Mm-hmm.
right? Every
Right.
school has that available. And I think that part of that is better diagnostics. I think part of that has been better advocacy over the years for kids and families that have, special needs. And, part of that has been as a result of that advocacy, more effective policy that has influenced how schools have to operate and what they have to offer. And so,
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's all very helpful and very supportive for kids and families. So we again, I'll bring it back. If we have a solid process and apply that to every case in the right way, we will get the information we need. Sometimes that information reveals itself very quickly. Sometimes it reveals itself more slowly over time, but we need to have access to all of that information to be able to make the appropriate recommendations. So I totally and wholly rely on open and honest conversation with families. If they're not being honest with me and I have incomplete information, can't particularly be helpful to them.
What do if a family or a child has, if the child has an IEP or 504, how exactly do they make that transition from one school to the next? Meaning, like, does that IEP and 504 follow them, or do they need to make a new one with the new school? And do you help them with that process?
So there's really particular stuff around this. And in a lot of ways view us as a bit of a general contractor, right? And so when appropriate, we call in the subcontractors. So there are a great number of really wonderful and smart and dedicated and passionate advocates and educational attorneys and all sorts of other resources in this area for families. So when we start to get into really specialized programming and what particular stuff about IEPs and advocacy and, representing families at meetings, that's something we don't do. At that point, it's really important to bring in those professionals who do
Mhm.
exactly that.
Okay.
And so then we work together hand in hand with those other professionals. So it's not uncommon for sometimes I'm working with a family and I'm involved, an educational attorney's involved, an advocate's involved, a financial planner's involved, all these different people. And we all have to work together as a team to make sure that we're providing best service for the kid and the family.
Okay, that's fascinating. I feel like we need to do a whole nother call another
Yeah.
time on all of that.
Well, that would be fun. And, we could actually bring some of those people in. We could bring in advocates and educational attorneys and whoever else and,
Right.
let them show off their great bodies of knowledge.
Right. And as we know on the main line, families tend to be really big advocates for their children,
Mhm.
especially if they have special needs, but just in general, they're advocates for their children. So I
Yeah.
think
And again,
there could be a lot
there's a
of
lot of
families.
people, there's a lot of people here who are well educated, who are successful, and
Yes.
who are, the thing about the East Coast is people are more proactive, right? And people are sort of have that go get it mentality. And so when you put all those different factors together, there's a lot of people who really want to push on districts and push on schools. And I think that's appropriate. It's a parent's job to advocate for their child's needs and their
Right.
child's interest. There's a way to do that that is going to maximize the return, right? So I always advise any parent when you're getting into these particular conversations about legal stuff or what's required under particular acts or laws or whatever it may be, you need to make sure that you are following the advice of the professionals that you're hiring. So bring in the attorney, bring in the advocate, let
Mm-hmm.
them guide you on how, when, and where to have the conversations with the districts that you have to have.
Right. Absolutely. I love that advice. So, how long do families typically spend with you? And I know that every family is different, so this is going to look different, but
Yeah.
is it something where, like, I'm going to call you, Mike, and we're going to talk, and it might be like a few hours of consultation over a few weeks? Or is it something that goes on for a while?
Yeah, so it depends on what kind of case we're working on. So with some of the more acute therapeutic cases where kids have particular behavioral or mental health needs, some of those can move really quickly. Sometimes we're having to make significant decisions, very significant decisions in 24, 48 hours. And those are intense and quick. And I will tell you the amount of empathy that I have for parents that are in that position, it's heartbreaking what I see some families go through, and
Yeah,
I just see our role as trying to make that process easier. So much of it, so much of the information, and again, the size and scope of the decisions that they have to make accordingly is head spinning
right.
and heart wrenching. And so if we can come in and make that process easier and shoulder some of that burden for parents, it's an honor to be able to do so and to come into people's lives at really vulnerable times. Likewise, when we're working with kids on evaluating more traditional options, whether we're looking at, I don't know, transferring to an independent school next year or evaluating boarding schools or whatever it may be, that takes a lot more time, right? That's more nuanced work, or maybe it's not more nuanced, but the pace of it is very different, right?
Okay.
And so in those kind of instances, we're taking weeks and months to work together. The other thing that we want to be able to do is go through the process with families. So we don't just take you to the door and drop you off and say, okay, good luck, hope things go well. We want to stay in touch. We want to be involved. We want to be kept in the loop on all the information that's coming back from the school so that
Hmm.
we're, as up to date as we can be in the event that you need us. So we want to be a resource for families as they're going through that. So if they're hearing something from the school and maybe it doesn't quite sit right with the parents, they can call and say, this is what the school or the program or whoever is telling us. Is this normal? Is this okay?
Hmm.
And we can say, yep, absolutely, totally normal. Here's why they're doing that. This is probably what they're going to do next. Or we can also say, that sounds a little off or strange or whatever it may be. Let us dig in the dirt and make a call or two and get back to you. So we can
Hmm.
help to support parents through that. We can help to normalize some of the information. We can help to translate some of those conversations in some ways. So we like to try to stay involved with parents over time. Clearly, the longer a student is at a school, the less we're involved, the more successful they are, right? But as much as we can stay involved to some degree, I think that's helpful for the parents and ultimately best for the kid.
So I know that one of your, I mean, I sense that one of your main jobs with families is to educate them on options are available to them. Are there any misconceptions or myths about the mainline schools or school districts in particular that you encounter sometimes or all the time?
Yeah. So I'm going to be a little bit brave in my answer here because I think that this is something that I'm really passionate about. I think probably the thing that I run into most is people getting really attached to brand name, right? They hear, I want to go to this school because it's the best, right? To
Yeah.
me, there are very few schools out there that are in the abstract the best for every kid. I get asked all the time, is such and such a good school, or is that a good school, or is that a bad school, or whatever it may be. In
Hmm.
my opinion, any school is only good or bad relative to the child and family in question, right? So I absolutely and wholly take a best fit approach in doing this. I try not to get caught up or tripped up by the notion of I want my kid to go to the best school that's going to set them up best to go to Harvard or Yale and that's going to land them a job with whoever, right? I don't I find that approach, I sometimes see a lot of kids drowning in that approach. And I see kids become unhappy when they're driven in that way, and ultimately they become unsuccessful in that way. And listen, at the same time, there are some students for whom that's the right path, right? And that's the way to go. I try to look at it a little bit more holistically and try to try to just evaluate what the particular kids and families needs are and match them up with the schools that are best for that approach. I try not to view the school that the children go to as any sort of trophy or any sort of indicator of how well a kid or a family is doing in society. I think it's
Hmm.
about evaluating what's best for that individual kid. And
Yeah.
again, the family as a whole. And, I think that we see that kids who are healthy and kids who are successful, ultimately become better producers, right? They become more prepared to head off into the world, whether that's going to college or entering the workforce or whatever it is they're going to go do. They become better there. And I oftentimes see families falling into what I believe is a trap of their goal is to get their kid into the best college they can. I look at it as getting into college is not your goal. Successfully getting through college is your goal, or if college is the right route.
Right.
And that requires taking an inventory of what skills you currently have, what skills are present, and what skills are lacking, and how do you build on those areas of need or those areas of development, so that when the student goes off to again school or the workforce or whatever, and is independent in the world, do they have what it takes to be successful when they get there? It's not just about getting there. So I think that's probably the biggest misconception or myth that I find people falling into is what school sticker can I attach on the back of my car,
Hmm.
and what is the best, and what is going to set them up most successfully for the future. And listen, I'm a huge believer in setting kids up best for their future, but to me that's about identifying where they are, where we want them to be, and that comes back to those big picture goals and objectives, and what is the path from getting from point A to point B.
I'm sure that, the ones that are considering the public schools in particular, I see this all the time as a real estate agent and just, among my friends and even people, who I've gone to school with who, are very well educated. They're really interested in the test scores of the district. And I'll break that down to say not only the district, but also like the elementary catchment area. They want to know
Yeah.
which is the elementary school that I should send my kids to in Lower Merion. Is it Marion Elementary? Is it Gladwin? Is one of those better than the other? Is it
Yeah.
Ballackinwood or
Yeah.
Penwyn? So what sort of advice, if any, do you give families on using scores to sort of like assess whether this school, whether this district is really effective on an educational level?
So to me, that comes back to similar answer to the last question. I think to some degree, when we look at what's available for families in the suburbs of Philadelphia, we're looking at some really good districts on a regional scale, on a state scale, and on a national scale.
Mm-hmm.
I think to some degree you're splitting hairs if you're analyzing, the test scores from here versus test scores from there. I think that's good. It's a good guidepost, right? In my opinion, I don't necessarily know that is the one piece of data or the one piece of criteria that I would hang my hat on. I think there are a number of things that go into the decision about where to live and what schools to look at. And for some families, test scores are going to be that ultimate data point, and that's okay. I also try again to step back and look at it holistically, because a lot of families have multiple children, and sometimes what is really best for one kid may not be the best for the other.
Yeah.
And you also have to, I mean, you're the real estate agent, you tell me, like, when people are looking at a house, you have to factor in any number of different things, right? You have to figure it out, access to commutes, access to things that we all like, restaurants and playgrounds and
Right.
parks and all these different things. So I think that it's a good thing for families to look at it from a bigger picture and look at it a little bit holistically, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes step back and ask yourself, I'm in the Lower Merion district. Does it, at the end of the day, when my kid's 30 years old, is it ultimately going to make that big of a difference on which catchment we got into?
Mm-hmm.
I, like you, and probably like a lot of people out there, I've worked with people who have worked with people and come across people in the world who have gone to very, very good schools, right? And ultimately, I think that probably, and likewise, I've worked with people who've gone to good schools that aren't probably some of the top names out there, who are incredibly bright and incredibly
Right.
thoughtful and incredibly successful.
Yeah.
I'm sort of a believer that it's more about what you do with what you have than it is necessarily about splitting hairs between one test score versus another. We also have to keep in mind that districts teach to tests, and so
Right.
we're really trying to funnel all these beautiful different kinds of learners out there in the world. And again, we go back, we're learning more and more every year about how children learn. And if we take that entirely beautiful broad spectrum and try and distill it down to teaching towards one particular method of testing, don't know that that's representative of trying to match up with every kid's needs and skill sets and strengths. So I just try to look at it a little bit more holistically than that. Again, that may be a little bit of a controversial opinion at times. I just go back to sometimes I've worked with people who have gone to brand name schools and aren't, to me, in the abstract, any better at their job necessarily, or
Right.
than people who haven't. Again, I think that critical thinking and the ability to evaluate information critically and good old fashioned grit and hard work go a really long way in this world.
Yeah.
And so sometimes if you, yeah, I just think it sometimes it can be splitting hairs, and sometimes it can also be a really, again, wonderful guidepost of saying if all other things in a family's decision line up to head in one way versus another, that can be sort of maybe a deciding factor or a good piece of information to go by.
So when families are looking around online at schools, and we all know that they look around online at schools. I mean, they
For
look
sure.
at not only the district websites, but I feel like all of the websites that are out there that try to rank schools based on whatever test scores and other things. They try to do like diversity, student to teacher ratio. There's like all these metrics, and then they'll be like, this is an A plus school, or this is A, or a
Yeah.
solid B. For a family who might be moving to the main line and does not have the resources or time to contact you, are there any online tools that you would actually recommend that people look at?
Well, it's a funny thing. So for example, when you're looking at the independent schools, right, there are all websites, including my own and probably yours too. They're written with the objective of having the person pick up the phone and make a call and engage,
Right.
right? So schools are no different. All the schools' websites, they all have wonderfully shiny and beautiful pictures with a lot of smiles and happy people and try to put their best foot forward. I think that nothing can replace good old conversation and good old engagement with schools. Certainly getting on campus and visiting is very helpful. Thankfully, we're through the pandemic where that becomes more of an option and people aren't having to do as many virtual visits anymore.
Right.
And you can look at it. For example, there's ADVIS, the Association of Delaware Valley Independent Schools, and I think there's something like close to, gosh, maybe almost 120 or 110 or something like that member schools, and so that can be a good way to filter some of the information because that's
Mm-hmm.
an organization that's for and represents those kinds of schools, and it can give you some insight and some inside information that is probably things like that are helpful for people that I think are coming from elsewhere and moving to the greater Philadelphia area. I
Yeah.
think one of the other things about this area is that we have a lot of multi-generational families here, right? This isn't a place like, New York City or San Diego or Los Angeles or wherever else in the world where there's a lot of transplants, right? Where people are constantly moving or they're newer. This is one of the oldest parts of the country, and there are a lot of families who have been here a long time, and a lot of kids either stay in this area once they move into
Yeah.
adulthood, or they go out and they come back. So there's this body of knowledge about different schools, whether those are public schools or independent schools, that has been grown over generations and decades. And so I think that being able to rely on some of that information, generally speaking, everybody knows the sort of general profile of who any particular school wants to work with. So, I think it does require sometimes getting into some of that more particular data, looking at different websites, talking to friends, talking to family, talking to neighbors, talking to real estate agents, talking to people
Right.
like myself, also other folks in the community, therapists, again, tutors, psychiatrists. All those people have had a lot of experience in
Yeah.
working with kids and families who have gone to different schools. So again, these are big decisions. They're important decisions. And I think information is always a good thing. You don't always use all of it, but you can never have too much information, in my opinion.
So, Mike, I think we covered a lot today. I want to thank you again for being here. For people who want to find out more about you or get in touch with you, what is the best way to do that?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And the our company is called Redwood Educational Services, and the website is consultredwood.com. And that's probably the easiest way. All of the contact information is on there. So again, go to our website, check it out,
And then call us.
and then call us, and we'll happily engage with you. Yeah, but thank you for having me on. I really appreciate the discussion and the opportunity to talk about these kinds of things that clearly I'm pretty passionate about.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here.